Oh, Jordan's here, my mother Helen said when I walked into Thanksgiving dinner, her tone suggesting I'd arrived uninvited rather than on time at 3 p.m. like she'd requested. I stood in the doorway of my childhood home, holding a pie I'd baked and a bottle of wine, watching my older sister Tessa and brother Marcus barely glance up from their phones while my father Vincent continued his conversation about Marcus's recent promotion like I hadn't entered the room. This wasn't new. I'd spent 28 years being the overlooked middle child, the one whose achievements were met with distracted nods, while Tessa's marketing job and Marcus's sales career received standing ovations. But something felt different today. As I set my contributions on the kitchen counter, my mother asked where I'd gotten the wine, and when I said I'd picked it up after my speaking engagement downtown, she didn't ask what I'd been speaking about. She just nodded and returned to basting the turkey. But then she said something that made me pause. How much do those speaking things usually pay? I told her this one had paid $1,500, and she exchanged a quick glance with my father that I couldn't quite read. Dinner proceeded as expected. Tessa dominated conversation, talking about her company's new office space. Marcus bragged about his sales numbers, and when I mentioned that my consulting business had just signed its largest contract worth $240,000, my father changed the subject to ask Marcus about his golf game. I was used to this treatment, had learned to expect it, but I kept noticing small things that felt off. My mother asked specific questions about my upcoming travel schedule. Did I have trips planned for December? Would I be available on certain dates? And when I answered vaguely, she pressed for details in a way she never had before. Later, when I mentioned considering a move to Seattle for better business opportunities, my father's head snapped up and he said, "You can't move to Seattle," with an urgency that seemed disproportionate to his usual indifference about my life. My Uncle Howard, who'd been drinking heavily, laughed and said, "Vincent, you can't keep the golden goose in the backyard forever." And my father shot him a look that could have frozen water. After dinner, I helped clean up while Tessa and Marcus retreated to the living room. My mother was scrubbing dishes when she said, almost casually, "Your father and I were talking, and we think you should be more careful about who you share financial information with." I asked what she meant, and she said she'd heard I'd been talking to a financial advisor about investment properties. The problem was I'd never mentioned this to my family. I'd only discussed it with my advisor in a private meeting 2 weeks ago. When I pointed this out, my mother's face went blank for just a moment before she said, "Oh, maybe Tessa mentioned it," which made no sense because Tessa didn't know either. I dried my hands slowly, my mind working through the implications. How did my mother know about conversations I'd never shared? I made a mental note to check my email and financial accounts when I got home, a small seed of suspicion taking root in my chest. Over the next few weeks, the strange pattern continued. My father called me 3 times, more than he'd called in the entire previous year, asking about my business, my client list, my revenue projections. He framed the questions as parental interest, just wanting to understand what you do, but the specificity felt invasive. He asked about my biggest clients by name, about contract renewal dates, about whether I had long-term agreements in place. When I asked why, he wanted to know. He said he was proud of my success and wanted to be able to brag to his friends, but his tone didn't match the words. Then my brother Marcus called asking if I could do him a favor and be a professional reference for a business loan he was applying for. I asked what kind of loan, and he was evasive, just saying it was a real estate investment opportunity, and the bank wanted references from successful business owners in the family. Something about the request felt calculated, like he'd been told exactly what to ask for. I started paying closer attention to family communications and noticed patterns I'd missed before. Every time I posted about a new client or achievement on LinkedIn, my mother would text within hours asking about my schedule or availability. When I won a regional business award in October, my father suddenly invited me to lunch, the first time he'd initiated one-on-one time in years, and spent the entire meal asking about my business finances and whether I had contingency plans in place. He specifically asked if I'd appointed anyone as emergency contact for business decisions if something happened to me. And when I said I hadn't thought about it, he suggested I should name family members just in case. The conversation made my skin crawl, but I couldn't articulate why. I started keeping a document on my phone logging these interactions, noting dates and specific questions, building a record of something I didn't yet understand but knew wasn't normal. The clearest sign something was wrong came when my sister Tessa posted on social media about our family's legacy of entrepreneurship and business success, tagging me alongside herself and Marcus. The post talked about how we'd all built thriving careers and how our parents had instilled strong business values. The problem was Tessa had spent years minimizing my work, calling my consulting business freelancing with air quotes and implying it wasn't a real career. Now she was claiming my success as part of the family narrative. When I commented asking why she'd included me when she usually dismissed my work, she deleted my comment within minutes and called me saying I was being ungrateful and embarrassing the family. She said I should appreciate being included and that my attitude problem was why nobody talked about my achievements. I made it difficult by being defensive. The gaslighting was familiar, but the sudden desire to claim my success publicly was new and deeply unsettling. I hired a private investigator, a woman named Simone Brooks, who specialized in family financial fraud, to look into whether my name was being used without my permission. I explained the strange questions, the sudden interest in my business, the way my family seemed to know details I hadn't shared. Simone said these were red flags for identity theft or unauthorized use of someone's credit and reputation. Within a week, she called with preliminary findings that made my stomach drop. My name appeared as a co-guarantor on a business loan my father had taken out 8 months ago for $450,000. The loan application listed me as a business partner and financial backup and included my tax returns, documents I'd never provided to my father, as proof of income to secure the loan. Simone also found that my mother had listed me as an emergency reference on credit applications, and that Marcus's recent business loan had used my business credentials as supporting documentation without my knowledge. They weren't just ignoring my achievements, they were quietly exploiting them for their own financial benefit. The discovery hit me like cold water. Years of being dismissed and overlooked suddenly made sense when I understood they'd been using my success as collateral while keeping me in the dark. Simone dug deeper and found more evidence of exploitation. My business license number and tax ID had been used on applications for Marcus's rental properties as proof of family business holdings. My professional certifications had been referenced in my father's loan documents as evidence of family expertise and credibility. They'd created a narrative that we were a family of successful entrepreneurs, using my legitimate achievements to prop up their shaky ventures, all while treating me like I was barely worth acknowledging in person. The pattern was clear. They needed me invisible enough not to ask questions, but successful enough to use as leverage. Simone said this was technically legal if they had copies of my documents, which they could have obtained from old family tax filings or shared accounts. But using them without permission was ethically dubious and potentially actionable if I could prove financial harm. I started noticing the dependency went beyond just financial documents. My uncle Howard, my father's brother who worked in commercial real estate, let slip at a family gathering that he'd gotten several new clients after mentioning his niece, the business consultant who works with Fortune 500 companies. When I asked him to clarify, he said my father had been talking up my client list at networking events, name-dropping companies I'd worked with to boost the family's credibility in business circles. My mother had apparently told her entire social circle that I consulted for major corporations, using it to elevate her own status and open doors for Tessa's marketing business. They'd built an entire mythology around my success while simultaneously diminishing it to my face, keeping me humble and unaware of how much they were profiting from my reputation. The realization was nauseating. Every dismissive comment, every time they'd changed the subject when I talked about work, had been strategic silence designed to keep me from realizing my value. I decided to test my theory by casually mentioning at Sunday dinner that I was considering closing my consulting business to pursue a corporate job offer in Seattle. The reaction was immediate and disproportionate. My father nearly choked on his wine. My mother's face went pale, and Marcus actually stood up from the table looking panicked. My father said I couldn't possibly be serious, that I'd built such a strong business, that it would be foolish to throw it away. My mother said Seattle was too far, and what would happen to family obligations. Marcus asked what would happen to my existing contracts and clients and whether I'd be maintaining my business license and certifications. Their concern was transparently about their needs, not mine, and watching them scramble gave me a dark satisfaction. When I pressed and asked why they cared so much about my business decisions when they'd never shown interest before, my father said, "Of course we care, your family," but his eyes wouldn't meet mine. Something was about to collapse in their world, and I was the keystone holding it together. The following week, I received mail that wasn't addressed to me, a letter to my father at my address, which had been written incorrectly on the envelope. I opened it and found a notice from First Continental Bank regarding co-guarantor obligations on account 4782-3391. The letter stated that the primary account holder had missed 2 consecutive payments and that as co-guarantor, I would be held responsible if payments weren't brought current within 30 days. My name was listed clearly as Jordan Hayes, co-guarantor, with my address and social security number. I'd never signed anything for this account. I'd never even heard of it. I called Simone immediately, and she subpoenaed the bank records through legal channels I didn't fully understand, but was grateful existed. The account was a business line of credit my father had opened 18 months ago, using my forged signature on the guarantee documents. The bank had never contacted me directly to verify because they'd used an email address I didn't control, one my father had apparently set up in my name specifically for this purpose. Simone's investigation revealed the full scope. My father had opened 3 separate business credit lines, totaling $670,000, using my name, credentials, and tax information as co-guarantor or collateral support. He'd forged my signature on documents, badly, according to the handwriting expert Simone consulted, but well enough that busy bank processors hadn't caught it. The money had been used to prop up his failing consulting business and to invest in Marcus's rental properties, which were underwater and hemorrhaging money. My mother had used my professional reputation to secure vendor contracts for Tessa's marketing firm, telling potential clients that Tessa came from a family of successful business consultants and that I could vouch for her work. They'd built an entire financial house of cards, using my achievements as the foundation, and now that their ventures were failing, the structure was collapsing. The bank letters I'd intercepted were just the beginning. Default notices were coming for all 3 credit lines. I met with an attorney named Patricia Vance, who specialized in family fraud and identity theft. She reviewed Simone's findings and told me I had strong grounds for criminal charges against my father for forgery and fraud, and potential civil suits against the entire family for financial exploitation and damages to my credit and reputation. The forged signatures alone were multiple felonies. Patricia said the smartest move would be to file a police report immediately, contact the credit bureaus to flag the fraudulent accounts, and begin the process of removing my name from the obligations. But she also said there was another option. I could use this knowledge as leverage to expose their dependency publicly and force accountability on my terms. The legal process could take years and might destroy family relationships permanently. Controlled exposure would be faster and more devastating. I asked what controlled exposure would look like, and Patricia smiled in a way that made me understand why she was so successful. She said we'd need to wait for the right moment, a public family event where the truth could spread organically and consequences would be immediate. That moment came sooner than expected. My mother called to tell me about a family celebration they were planning for my father's 60th birthday. A formal dinner at an upscale restaurant with extended family, business associates, and community leaders. She said it was important I attend and dress appropriately because my father's business partners would be there. She also asked, with unusual directness, if I could help with some of the costs, since the event was expensive and they were having cash flow issues at the moment. I agreed to attend and said I'd contribute, not mentioning that I now understood the cash flow issues were because my father's fraudulent business ventures were failing. My mother seemed relieved and said, "I knew we could count on you, even if we don't always show it." The phrase was telling. They'd always counted on me, just in ways I'd never consented to. I told Patricia about the event, and we began planning exactly how I'd expose the truth in a way that would leave them no room to deny or deflect. The party was scheduled for late January at the Riverside Country Club, a venue my father had chosen specifically because it would impress his business contacts. My mother sent me the guest list, 80 people, including family, my father's clients and investors, local business owners, and several people from the bank that held his fraudulent credit lines. She also sent me a schedule showing that my father would give a speech at 7:30 p.m. about family, legacy, and the next chapter of success, followed by toasts from family members. She'd assigned me a toast slot at 7:45 p.m., right after Marcus and Tessa. The presumption that I'd participate in celebrating a man who'd committed fraud using my identity was audacious, but I told her I'd be honored to speak. Patricia and I spent weeks preparing exactly what I'd say and how I'd deliver it. The key was planting information strategically and letting others connect the dots, creating organic panic rather than making accusations that could be dismissed as family drama. 2 weeks before the party, my father called asking if we could meet for coffee to discuss something important. We met at a cafe downtown, and he spent 20 minutes dancing around the real topic before finally admitting he was having temporary financial difficulties with some business investments. He said he needed to consolidate some accounts and wondered if I'd be willing to formally join as a business partner on paper to help improve his credit position. He framed it as an opportunity for me to finally be recognized as part of the family business and suggested it would be good for both of us. I pretended to consider it seriously, asking detailed questions about exactly which accounts he wanted my name on and what the current balances were. His answers were vague and evasive, confirming he knew exactly how much trouble he was in. I told him I'd think about it, and his relief was palpable. He had no idea I already knew everything and was counting down days until I'd expose it publicly. The week before the party, I received an urgent email from Marcus asking if I could guarantee a 6-month lease extension for one of his rental properties because the bank was threatening foreclosure. The email revealed more than he'd intended. He wrote that Dad's situation is making my loans harder to manage, and that if I could use my business credentials to back the extension, it would help the whole family. The casual assumption that I'd risk my professional reputation to save his failing investments was remarkable. I responded saying I'd discuss it at Dad's party, which seemed to satisfy him. My mother called the next day asking if I'd finalized my toast remarks and suggesting I might want to mention how grateful I was for family support in building my business. The irony was almost funny. They wanted me to publicly thank them for supporting success they'd actively exploited. I told her I'd definitely mention the family's role in my career, which was technically true. 3 days before the party, I discovered why the family was so panicked. Simone found a lawsuit filing showing that First Continental Bank was moving to collect on my father's defaulted credit lines, with me listed as responsible co-guarantor for $670,000. The lawsuit would become public record within a month, which meant my father's fraud would be exposed regardless of what I did. The party wasn't just a birthday celebration, it was a last-ditch effort to project success and stability before everything collapsed. My father was trying to reassure investors and business partners that everything was fine, using the party as theater to maintain confidence. He was probably planning to announce some new business venture or partnership at his speech, hoping to buy time before the legal consequences arrived. Understanding this timeline changed my approach. I didn't need to destroy his reputation. I just needed to accelerate the inevitable and make sure everyone understood how my name had been used without consent. The night before the party, I had dinner with Patricia and Simone to finalize the plan. I'd give my toast as scheduled, but instead of the grateful family tribute my mother expected, I'd share one specific, verifiable fact and let the guests who mattered connect the dots themselves. Patricia had prepared a packet of documents, copies of the forged signature pages, the bank notices listing me as co-guarantor, and a timeline showing I'd never consented to any of it. These packets would be handed to specific guests immediately after my toast: the bank executives in attendance, my father's primary investors, and several family members who'd been kept in the dark like me. The beauty of this approach was that I wouldn't have to convince anyone of anything. The documents would speak for themselves, and the panic would spread organically through the room as people realized what they were looking at. Simone asked if I was sure I wanted to do this publicly, and I said I'd spent 28 years being invisible while they used my worth for their gain. It was time everyone saw exactly what I was worth and what they'd done with it. I arrived at the Riverside Country Club at 6:30 p.m., wearing a professional navy suit and carrying a leather folder containing my toast notes. The room was elegant: white tablecloths, crystal glasses, floral centerpieces, and filled with people I barely knew, but who apparently all knew of me through my family's mythology. My Uncle Howard greeted me warmly and said, "The famous Jordan, your dad never shuts up about your business success." A woman introduced herself as one of my father's investors and mentioned she'd been impressed to learn his daughter consulted for major corporations. I smiled and thanked her, noting her name for the packet distribution later. My father worked the room confidently, his arm around various guests, playing the successful patriarch role he'd crafted. My mother looked nervous, her eyes finding me repeatedly across the room. She knew something was slightly off, but couldn't identify what. Marcus and Tessa stood together near the bar, and I overheard Marcus telling someone, "Yeah, our whole family is in business. It's kind of our thing." At 7:30 p.m., my father stepped to the microphone and began his speech. He talked about family legacy, about building success through hard work and integrity, about the next generation of Hayses making their mark on the business world. He specifically mentioned my talented children: Marcus in real estate, Tessa in marketing, and Jordan in consulting, who make me proud every day. The acknowledgement would have meant something years ago, but now I understood it was performance, using my legitimacy to boost his credibility in front of investors and bank executives. He announced a new business venture, a commercial development project he was launching with Marcus, and said he was confident in its success because it's backed by the Hayes family reputation and expertise. Several people in the audience nodded approvingly. The bank executives took notes. My father raised his glass and toasted to family, success, and the future. When he finished, applause filled the room, and my mother was crying, happy tears. Marcus gave his toast next, thanking our father for believing in my potential and supporting my investments. Then Tessa thanked him for teaching us the value of family loyalty. My turn came at 7:45 p.m. I stood, walked to the microphone, and looked out at 80 faces turned toward me expectantly. I began by thanking everyone for coming to celebrate my father's birthday. And then I said, "I want to talk about something important, the ways family members depend on each other, sometimes without even realizing it." I paused and pulled out a single document from my folder. 6 months ago, I discovered my name had been listed as co-guarantor on several business loans totaling over $600,000. Loans I never signed for, accounts I never authorized, obligations I never agreed to. The room went silent. My father's face drained of color. I continued, "I also learned my professional credentials and client relationships were being used to secure investments and contracts I had no involvement in. My achievements weren't being ignored. They were being quietly leveraged by family members who found my success more useful than acknowledging it." I looked directly at my father. So when we talk about family legacy and working together, I think it's important everyone understands exactly how that partnership has functioned. Before anyone could respond, I gestured to Simone, who'd been seated near the back. She moved through the room distributing document packets to specific guests: the bank executives, the investors, several family members, and the lawyer I'd noticed taking notes throughout dinner. Each packet contained copies of the forged documents, the loan agreements listing me without consent, and a notarized statement from a handwriting expert confirming the signatures weren't mine. I returned to the microphone and said, "I've spent the last 3 months working with attorneys and investigators to understand the full scope of how my name and reputation have been used. The documents being distributed show that pattern clearly. I want everyone here to understand that I never authorized these obligations, never agreed to guarantee these debts, and never consented to having my professional success used as collateral for ventures I wasn't part of." Whispers spread through the room as people opened the packets. The bank executives immediately pulled out their phones. My father stood frozen at his table, and my mother was crying for very different reasons now. The room erupted into controlled chaos, hushed conversations, urgent phone calls, chairs scraping as people repositioned to read documents together. One of the bank executives approached my father's table, demanding to speak with him privately. An investor I didn't know stood and announced he was withdrawing from the commercial development project, saying he'd been operating under false pretenses about the family's financial stability. My Uncle Howard looked horrified, staring at my father and asking, "Vincent, what did you do?" Marcus tried to approach me, but I held up my hand and said into the microphone, "I've already taken action to protect myself. My attorneys have filed formal disputes on all fraudulent accounts. I've reported the forged signatures to the appropriate authorities, and I've withdrawn any implicit or explicit support for business ventures I wasn't genuinely consulted about." That all happened last week. The revelation that I'd already acted, that this wasn't a threat but a done deal, sent a new wave of panic through the room. My father had based his new venture announcement on assumed access to my credentials and reputation, and I'd removed that foundation before he'd even given his speech. I concluded my toast by saying, "I've learned something valuable through this experience. Worth isn't about being acknowledged by people who only see your value when they can use it. Real worth is knowing what you bring to any situation and refusing to let others exploit it while pretending it doesn't exist." So happy birthday, Dad. I hope you've enjoyed building your legacy on my achievements, because as of today, that foundation is gone. I set down the microphone and walked out of the Riverside Country Club while the room remained in shocked silence behind me. My father's business collapsed within a month. The bank lawsuit proceeded, investors withdrew, and the commercial development project dissolved. Marcus lost 2 rental properties to foreclosure, and Tessa's marketing firm lost several clients who felt deceived about the family connections. My father faced criminal charges for the forged signatures, ultimately pleading guilty to fraud and receiving probation plus restitution requirements. My mother called weekly for months, begging me to fix this and help the family, never once apologizing for the years of exploitation. I changed my phone number. I rebuilt my professional reputation through honest relationships and transparent work. And I learned that the family who finally saw my worth, after I'd taken it back from them, no longer had any claim to it. They'd ignored my achievements until they needed them, then tried to own them without acknowledgement. But worth isn't something others can take or diminish. It's something you define for yourself and protect fiercely from anyone who'd use it while pretending it doesn't exist. They finally understood what I was worth, but by then, that worth no longer belonged to them.